from Spurs, from Liverpool. I've seen Arsenal links, and now Chelsea seem to be coming into the mix. What's the current state of play with Murillo, and is he going to stay?
Yeah, I think he's happy to stay at Forest. I don't think it's quite a Murillo situation, and at this stage I think it's more likely that he does remain as well.
Guys, welcome back to a special episode where we're going to be talking about all the Nottingham Forest transfers with the guru himself, Ben Jacobs. Ben, how are you doing, mate? And thank you for taking the time, buddy.
Yeah, great to be here. Looking forward to talking all things Forest.
Yeah, I mean, should we mention who you support, or should we keep that quiet for now?
Oh, you went straight there right from the beginning. Go on, you can mention it. It's fine. It's in my X profile.
Well, he is a Leicester fan, guys, so I'm sure he's coming with an open, warm heart towards Forest. And let me ask you, though, Ben, do you see us as rivals? I guess I'll kick off with that question, because I always ask my Leicester mates that.
Yeah, I was in a really interesting position growing up because I went to school in Loughborough, which is right on that intersect where you kind of got 50% Leicester, 50% Forest, even some Derby fans as well.
Ooh.
And there was always that sort of debate as to where the real rivalry is. And I'm of the belief from growing up in the school playground, if you like, that Leicester do not like Derby, and Derby do not like Forest, and Forest do not like Derby, and kind of at that point Leicester as well. But I always felt that we were a little bit of a third wheel at that point. And personally, I quite liked it. Of course, when we played Forest and Derby in particular, I wanted to beat both, but I never hated Forest. Whereas when Leicester played Derby County in the playoff final, that for me was like a proper rivalry. I didn't dare go to school if we lost that game. And when Steve Welsh scored an iconic header that Leicester fans will remember, it was one of those moments that you just used constantly to jokingly taunt all of your mates that were Derby fans. But I really like Forest. I think it's a great kind of historical club that has remained tied to its roots. And that's the beauty, isn't it? When you've got that kind of stadium and you have the glory when everyone says you're never going to be able to get there, and then you go all the way back down, and then you come all the way back up into the Premier League. But the roots of the club, they're still kind of the same. Whereas Derby got Pride Park, Leicester got the King Power Stadium. I'm not saying we don't like that modernisation, but the Leicester in the 90s versus now is completely different. Whereas you go back to Forest and you still sort of feel like, to a small degree anyway, it could be back in that kind of Clough era. And I quite like that.
Yeah. You're saying the right things. I like you now, Ben. I like you.
Just don't listen to what I say when they ask me the same question on a Leicester podcast next week.
Chat, if you like what Ben's saying, I've put his X or Twitter handle in the description. He's also on Playback, so I've got the link in there. Make sure you're following him on there. And let's jump into it, Ben. I want to start really by talking about the massive rumours we've had probably since May time on some of our key players and whether or not they'll be leaving Forest. If I can kick us off, if you don't mind, with Murillo. We've seen so many links to Murillo from Spurs, from Liverpool. I've seen Arsenal links, and now Chelsea seem to be coming into the mix and being the front runners with talks that they've inquired a couple of times about Murillo. What's the current state of play with Murillo, and is he going to stay?
Well, I think the good news is we're at that part of pre-season now where players want to be settled. And from Chelsea's point of view, it is true that they inquired on Murillo and that kind of profile they like. However, they've now signed Renato Vega, who is a left-sided fullback that can also play left-sided centre-back. So Chelsea may feel that they've ticked that box, and it might well be that one more left-sided centre-back is too many. And remember as well, you have Levi Colwill, who would expect, if fit, to be starting in that position. And on the other side, it's going to be really intriguing to see whether it's Wesley Fofana, Tosin, or a number of other centre-backs that Chelsea have got. So from Murillo's point of view, I think we have to go back to an interview that he did a few months ago, where he actually said if he could pick any Premier League club under the sun, he'd go to Man City. But then he kind of paused in the interview and said there might be an issue with game time. So you look at Chelsea, there's no guarantee that if he moved, he'd necessarily be playing regularly, because Chelsea rate Levi Colwill very highly. So it might well be that the door's shut now from Chelsea's perspective because of the arrival of Renato Vega and the fact, as I say, that he can play in both of those positions, and in fact in defensive midfield as well. But Chelsea do like Murillo, and they did make an inquiry. And from Forest's point of view, they're not in any position where they now feel forced to sell because the PSR deadline has passed. And even if they might still need some funds over the course of the next financial year, you got the back half of the summer, you got January, and you've got until the 30th of June 2025. So Chelsea haven't advanced anything yet. Arsenal made an inquiry, but they're right on the brink now of signing Riccardo Calafiori from Bologna in a deal for around 45 million euros. So that should shut the door there. So suddenly the options for Murillo are getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And what I'm told is that he would like to leave, not in the sense of he is forcing his way out or that he's unhappy at Forest, but if the right opportunity comes at, let's just call it a Big Six club, and he can go and play regularly and have, in particular, some form of European football, then he would tell Forest that he would like that opportunity. But nobody's actually presented him yet with that opportunity. And as time ticks away, it becomes increasingly likely, therefore, that Forest are going to be able to hang on to him. And I think if you look at the plan for Forest, they like the idea of Milinkovic and Murillo. Yeah. They complement each other in terms of the attributes they've got. They're different kind of defenders, but together that could be a very fearsome partnership. So at the time of recording anyway, it's all quiet on the Murillo front. And if Arsenal get Calafiori and if Chelsea are happy with their many defenders at the moment, then you suddenly start to think maybe, just maybe, the window will shut and Murillo will still be a Forest player, which I'm sure is what all Forest fans want to hear.
Yeah, I mean, there was a little divide after his interview where it's a case of when you wear the badge, even if you feel like that, you know, you got the Forest shirt on, say it quietly and privately and not on podcast. So that did split some of the opinions, but we know how good he is. I mean, is there any chance Liverpool could sniff around with him, with Virgil van Dijk potentially getting towards, you know, the twilight of his career? With the new manager coming in, is he going to look to reshape the Liverpool team at all?
Yeah, Liverpool do want a centre-back in that position, and it will be a surprise if the window shuts and they don't get one. They would have loved to bring in Yoel Hato from Ajax very early in the window, and Arsenal were looking at him too, but Liverpool never advanced that. So it was one of those links that never materialised because they felt like the player would stay at Ajax, and then Arsenal were more serious. And again, they felt exactly the same thing. Then more recently, they were in the conversation for Lenny Yoro. And it's quite an interesting one, that, because Liverpool don't overpromise within their recruitment. They won't go to a player and just say, we desperately want you, we're going to promise you the world. They'll be very upfront. And Liverpool's pitch to Yoro is, you're a generational talent, but you're going to need a couple of years, so we will ease you in. And as you rightly say, they got Virgil van Dijk there at the moment. And even though there's some Saudi interest in him, Liverpool like to have the player when the player that may depart is still there. So you have a transition. So Liverpool didn't overpromise to Yoro because they couldn't guarantee him that game time, but they thought their pathway and their long-term plan was best for the player. And ultimately, with the feeling at that point that Real Madrid were going to succeed, Liverpool backed off. And suddenly Manchester United come in and their approach was different. They said to Yoro, we're going to overpay, we're going to butter you up, and we're going to throw you in right now. So it does mean that Liverpool are still looking in that position. I'm not aware at this point that they've advanced anything with Murillo specifically. One of those links you hear often as a journalist, but actually when you check it out, not much substance yet. They like Mark Gahey. That one could be a possibility. And I also think the other thing I would add is within all these names, they're not as rigid under Arne Slot, I'm told, and within their recruitment team that it has to be one right-sided centre-back, one left-sided centre-back. Of course, you want that balance, so you've got options within your squad, but Arne Slot will happily play two left-sided or two right-sided centre-backs together. So it's just about having that depth and that quality. So at the moment, we're hearing a lot of noise about Murillo, but there's not actually any bids yet in the last few days or weeks at the table of Nottingham Forest. And the longer time ticks away, the more confident Forest will get that they ultimately either can keep the player or are not in a financial position where they have to sell. And that's why it's important that that financial cutoff has now passed. Now, the last thing I would say on that cutoff, without sending people to sleep on the financial side, is that there is this near miss period. So if, as Nottingham Forest tried in the past to argue, and Everton also to an extent, you get to a scenario where you're past the deadline, but you are working on a deal that started before the deadline, you can actually make that sale and try and plead mitigating circumstances and what's called a near miss. So until this month is out, there's always a chance, if teams have actually missed the deadline and are worried that they're going to suffer another penalty, that they might try one more big sale and then retrospectively put it on the last financial year. That's not impossible, but the messages I'm getting out of Forest is that they're okay for now.
Yeah, with the sale of Niakate and Mangala for quite hefty prices. That's the feeling we get as well. Just a final couple of questions on Murillo. Internationally, looking at maybe Spain and stuff, maybe Real, maybe some of the big ones there, Atletico Madrid. Is there any chance you feel that he could look at a move abroad? As you mentioned, he's interested in European football. Is there any possibility of any of those teams looking at potentially recruiting a centre-back?
Not Atleti at the moment. I think PSG are the ones to watch, and they're also looking for a left-sided centre-back still. They were in the conversation for Lenny Yoro as well. And we know that they've got this sort of Mbappe-shaped hole of finances that they can spend. And they're quite slow in the market at the moment because they are still settling with Mbappe and deciding exactly what this exit package will look like in terms of potentially him paying the club back a small percentage of the signing on fee. But if not, foregone loyalty bonuses, maybe he'll be prepared to surrender some of his wages that have been deferred by the club. And once that's fully settled, or once they get an idea of what the minimum is, plus, of course, the French TV rights that have dragged on, PSG will move in the market. And their number one priority is João Neves from Benfica. And I think at the moment they're pretty optimistic that that one could get done, maybe even as early as next week. Victor Osimhen is a player they're speaking to. Napoli, never easy to negotiate with. But the other position within the kind of spine of the team that they'll be looking to add is another left-sided centre-back. And they tried for Lenny Yoro. They like Chelsea's Levi Colwill, but nobody really feels that he'll be available in this window. So it might be a case of seeing where that's at in a year's time, because Chelsea see Colwill as untouchable. So that's where they start to shortlist other options. But it's all very early stages as well. And I also expect Wolves to be Forest, I should say, very firm in terms of the asking price. I don't think this is going to be any cut price deal just because the player wants to go. But like I said earlier, if there is an opportunity that presents itself whereby there's European football and it's a top six club or a globally renowned club playing in Champions League, then whether that's in England or abroad, I do think that there's a realistic chance that the player's head is turned.
Fascinating. Okay, I don't know if I feel happier or sadder or scared with all that, but it's very interesting what you're saying. If we can move on to Morgan Gibbs-White, there was a lot of links to Spurs and Newcastle to him about 6 or so weeks ago. But I feel they've gone a bit quiet with the Euros and everything, being played and haven't finished. What's the current state of play with Morgan Gibbs-White? Is he happy to stay at Forest, and is there interest from the likes of Spurs and Newcastle?
Yeah, I think he's happy to stay at Forest. I don't think it's quite a Murillo situation. And at this stage, I think it's more likely that he does remain as well. The merry-go-round in the final 2 weeks of the window is going to be the key stage, simply because even though season starts and you breathe a bit easy, you then have that last scramble where there's a domino effect. And Morgan Gibbs-White might, for example, still be on the list of a club, but not necessarily who they're working on now. And because of how things fall or because of other deals that don't happen, you might see a scenario where one or two of the clubs that you mentioned choose to move. So from Tottenham's point of view, they want to add some kind of either wide attacker or winger or playmaker, call it what you will. And the reason why I'm being so vague is because Ange Postecoglou likes players that can play either on both sides or wide and or central. And it's that versatility that he really feels is going to be the key to Tottenham succeeding. So Archie Gray, for example, is a good example. He joins for 40 million. He was a right back for Leeds, but Postecoglou's predominantly looking at him as a midfielder and to fully convert him into that position. So Morgan Gibbs-White has that kind of versatility, and we know that he can be very effective from wide areas. He can chip in with goals. He can play centrally, and Tottenham like that kind of profile. But at the moment, I think even though these are not necessarily identical profiles, they're focused on the likes of Eberici Eze and Pedro Neto at Wolves. Now, Eze is difficult because he's got a complicated release clause, a bit like Michael Elise. And with Tottenham, we know that Daniel Levy doesn't always do those kind of deals.
Yeah.
With Pedro Neto, it's very possible that Tottenham put an offer down roughly similar to what they bid for James Maddison when they were successful, 40, 45 million. But then they say, if you want 60 million to Wolves, we'll give you 5, 10, 50 million in add-ons, but contingent on appearances, because that way, if he stays fit, you're happy to pay the higher price. If he doesn't stay fit, maybe you don't hit the add-ons and then you get the player for a little bit less, because everybody in the industry likes Neto. However, he's got to stay fit. Otherwise, the investment isn't worth it.
Yeah.
So Tottenham are focused on other priorities at the moment. It'll be interesting to see what Aston Villa do as a slightly newer suitor, because the feeling is that Moussa Diaby is going to go off to Al Ittihad and they're going to bring in a fair amount of cash, and they may want to strengthen again in that kind of creative-minded, wide, central, versatile area. So that could still be potentially one to watch. I think with Newcastle, it's gone a little bit cold at the moment, and I don't think that they're looking to spend the bulk of their money in this particular position. My sense with Newcastle is that Callum Wilson may leave. They might want to bring in another striker. They need defensive reinforcements as well, because Sven Botman, for example, is injured until the end of the year, and one or two of Newcastle's central defenders are quite old at this stage, so they might need to strengthen in other areas. And the most interesting one for Morgan Gibbs-White later in the window, not that he would necessarily go for this kind of move, but you may remember a few years back, Crystal Palace were one of the clubs looking at the player when he eventually ended up joining Nottingham Forest instead. Now, it might seem like a sidestep to go from Forest to Palace, but from Palace's point of view, with their Elise money, if Eberici Eze goes as well, they're going to have to move urgently in, again, this broad type of area. And it may be that they try and reignite their interest. Now, I think Forest fans would like to feel that they wouldn't lose out to Palace in terms of overall package. But some players simply want to move to London, or they may feel that Palace have got a better chance of moving towards the top half of the table. Forest, obviously, with the points deduction, looking over their shoulder last season. So that can still be one to watch. But this is not a Murillo situation where the player's there dreaming of a Man City or a Big Six club. He's very focused at the moment on Nottingham Forest. So I still think that there's a pretty realistic chance that he stays.
That's good to hear. And just on the Newcastle point, with I forgot his name, the right winger now, Miguel. What's his name?
Almiron.
Gone blank. Yes,
Miguel Almiron,
he's potentially going to Saudi, and that's creating a gap to them on the right wing. There was talks of Elanga being linked with Newcastle. Is that still something that's potentially on the table if he does move?
Yeah, Newcastle love Elanga, and they tried to get Elanga originally as part of the swap deal for Elliot Anderson, and they push pretty hard. And as you rightly say, you've got Miguel Almiron. I'm not so sure that he'll end up in Saudi Arabia, only because as much as the Saudi deal makers want him, and that's true, this is the second window now where Saudi have circled Miguel Almiron, and on each occasion, Almiron's not been particularly keen. So the first time around, it was Al-Shabaab, who are not one of the PIF-controlled clubs, and then this time around, there's a couple of Saudi clubs that are seeing whether Almiron's changed his mind, and no luck so far. And of course, with Newcastle and them being Saudi-owned, if they got to that deadline and they needed various money, and we know they were scrambling around with lots of different ways of finding the seemingly in excess of 60 million that they needed to comply with PSR, going to Saudi and trying to get Wilson or Almiron to the Saudi Pro League would have been a very easy route to take if there was player buy-in. And the fact that that didn't happen before the PSR deadline would suggest to me that Almiron maybe doesn't want to go to Saudi Arabia, but he still could be sold. And if somebody puts down, I would imagine, in excess of 15 million and probably a bit close to 20 million, then Newcastle will sell Almiron. And at that point, they will want to invest. So Elanga's been a big target for Newcastle, but they've not had any breakthrough. And the simple fact is that Forest don't want to sell. So if the right offer came from Murillo and it was financially worthwhile and the player said he wanted to go, you probably say maybe it suits all parties at the right number, and it's a reluctant sale. With Morgan Gibbs-White, I think there'll be no real desire to let him go. And if the player is a bit more placid and less pushy in his desire, then that will settle that. And then with Elanga, I think Forest will be their most firm in this position. And maybe if it was going to happen for Newcastle, it would have done so when the Ali Anderson deal came to the table. So right now, Newcastle are not pursuing Elanga because they simply believe that Forest don't want to sell. There's been more recent inquiries from Atleti and Napoli as well, from abroad, to my knowledge, and they're getting the same kind of messages as well. So Forest are going to be pretty bullish on Elanga. And I think that I never want to say fans can rest 100% easy when a window is open, because we always have surprises and crazy offers and astronomical bids. But my point with this is that if Elanga was going to happen, it feels more logical to me, speaking to sources, that it would have been done before the PSR deadline rather than now after it.
Yeah. And just on the final player that's had some links as well, and he's fast becoming one of my favourites, is Callum Hudson-Odoi. Again, he was linked to Spurs a couple of weeks ago, and with Forest only paying peanuts for him, between 3 and 5 million, there's talks that there was potential bids going to come in for him at about 35-40 million pounds. As far as you're aware, is Callum Hudson-Odoi another one who's quite happy at Forest, or is there a chance on this one?
No, happy at Forest, but there might be a desire to cash in at the right price, because remember, Nottingham Forest only paid something in the region of 5 million, and that was including add-ons, but that was only last summer. So therefore, the Forest position is to keep the player. But if somebody wants to come in and bid in excess of 35 or 40 million, then Nottingham Forest might change their mind. Hudson-Odoi had a really difficult time as well, trying to get game time, trying to get his pathway, and he finally comes to Nottingham Forest and finds a bit of a purple patch. So from the player's point of view, there is a reticence about going off to a, let's just call it, European qualifier within the Premier League, and being worried that he's back there within that sort of Chelsea type situation where he's just not getting what he needs in order to progress as a player. So what's true is that right at the beginning of the window, 3 different clubs made formal inquiries to Nottingham Forest, not bids, but inquiries to say, like Hudson-Odoi, what are the terms? And Forest's position was very clear that if you want to give us a massive profit on what we paid, then in excess of sort of 35 or 40 million, depending on the structure of the deal, we'll consider it. But another player that they're not looking to sell, and again, like Morgan Gibbs-White, Hudson-Odoi is very happy playing for Nuno. So there's no feeling that he's desperate for a move away. So of all the names that we've mentioned, I actually think I'd be the most surprised if he departed now, because to put down that kind of fee just a year on from when he was worth 5 million, first of all, that would have to be the kind of club that is big six in stature and budgets. Because 40 million for half the Premier League is a club record. So I don't see your sort of Fulhams, your Brightons, etc., going in that area. And therefore, Hudson-Odoi would have to say, wait a minute, right when I'm settled, right when I'm enjoying my football, right when I'm in form, and right when I've only been at Forest for a year, I'm going to go back again into that Chelsea-type scenario, have a 40 million price tag over my head, and not necessarily play every single week. And it could set back his pathways. So this is why I think the player won't be thinking about money or prestige or Europe. He'll be thinking about himself and his pathways. And right now, he's very happy under Nuno. And that's why I would still expect him to stay.
Is it true about the sell-on percentage that Chelsea have on him? And that's one of the reasons why we got him so cheap. Do you know what that percentage roughly is?
I don't know the exact number, but I do know that Chelsea have got what was referred to at the time as a significant sell-on percentage. And usually significant means in the region of 15 or 20% rather than Manchester United times Greenwood, which is 50%. But Chelsea needed to resolve the situation, and they obviously didn't just want to have a cut price deal where they didn't benefit. So there will be something very healthy there. And of course, if it's 20% and it's a 40 million deal, you're paying on the profit. So that's 35 out of the 40. And then you do the maths and they end up getting another 7 million on top of that. So 20% of 35. And therefore the original fee at 5 million, they've more than doubled up. So it's smart business from Chelsea's point of view. And they obviously believe that when they sold the player, he could grow and have a higher valuation. But I still think a lot of this just comes down to Callum Hudson-Odoi and not the suitors. And like I said before, the player's settled. He's only been at Nottingham Forest for a year. Forest want to keep him. So all signs point to the fact, despite significant interest, that he'll end up staying at Nottingham Forest. Maybe famous last words, like I say, always leave it a little bit open because we have this mad late part of the window where someone's not even considering a player, but they lose out on another target and they pivot because they've got a bit of money to burn in the back pocket. But right now, it's actually all pretty quiet on the Callum Hudson-Odoi front.
And you mentioned there was 4 clubs that inquired about him. Do you know who those 4 clubs were?
No, we know from Forest that there were 3 inquiries, not 4 to my knowledge, and that some of those clubs were Premier League clubs, but I'm not aware of anyone actually turning that inquiry into anything formal. I think there was a point in time where one of those clubs was Villa, to my knowledge, and they didn't progress anything, but I'm not aware of the other specific clubs, only the fact that sources indicate that Forest were registered with 3 formal inquiries to basically understand the price and the terms, but nobody to my knowledge has followed that up with a bid.
Okay. I feel very positive. There's a lot of good news. You know, as you say, we can't hold you to it because crazy things we've seen happen in the window plenty of times. So that's kind of the main players we hear about potential moves out of Forest. If I can touch on the players coming in, mate. Is there any other juicy rumours going around at Forest that you're hearing with any other players at all, mate?
Albeit Milan are speaking like they want a minimum of 20 million euros. That's about 15 million quid. It might even be closer, 25 million euros. But